didn't exist. So there wasn't a system, if you call it that, for a young practitioner to evolve and develop their career in the early 2000s. You know, it was like a startup phase in some respects for the evolution of British sport. And even in pro sport, think about the broadcasting money and the launch of Sky. That was a very early era of how that was playing itself out. So no, I didn't. I just was curious, which is probably why I wanted to follow science, but just love the nature of sport. And university for me was probably a real foundation catalyst moment where I probably really stepped up in terms of wanting to learn and understand it a bit more. But you know, it'd be the same like graduates now today that have a similar passion. The jobs that exist for them in say 10 years time probably don't exist now. So I think that's just the nature of the society that we move in. Technology is moving much faster than humans can evolve, you know, and it's just changing the nature of the landscape that we operate in.
No, definitely. And then in terms of sports science in itself is just a massive area, from psychology, then you've got all the different areas of the physical side of things as well. Did you have an area that you thought at that point that you wanted to, or did you go, how did that work from your focus?
No, I mean, I love the I love the I guess the hardest subject, physiology, biomech, sort of metabolism side of things, really, more than social psychological side. So I was very much more down the data aspect of it, and I really enjoyed numbers, statistics, like that level of insight and understanding. So that was the area that I probably focused on a lot more in my sort of university years, really. You know, I eventually did my PhD at Loughborough, a very statistically driven approach around looking at epidemiology in football injuries, which is the really early years that an understanding of risk in sport began to emerge. So that's where my depth of understanding emerged before I then moved to the Olympic system. So I guess data, numbers, real analytical, logical style thinking and approach is what's always driven me.
Right. And then, so when you were doing your undergrads, is that something that you figured out pretty quickly, and like, did you plan to do the PhD whilst you were doing it?
No, not at all. I mean, I genuinely couldn't see above and beyond what I was doing at that moment in time. Probably wasn't until the third year that I generally thought about a master's. In some respects, this is the next step. I was enjoying studying things that I hadn't learned before. Really loved the area of coaching science, skill acquisition. As you say, the physiology, biomech side of things were things that I really got inspired by. But it wasn't until the third year, and I did relatively well in my undergrad, managed to get a scholarship to go to Loughborough and study masters in sports science, and then stayed on to do a PhD. So there was never a plan in some senses, really. Things felt natural the way they sort of evolved in front of you. And as I say, there wasn't a career path at that moment in time that existed, particularly in sport, or as somebody that would end up working as an applied practitioner in that sense. So again, that landscape's changed significantly in the past 20 years.
So in terms of doing that, they got the scholarship, and then would they all run back to back?
Yeah, I took a year out after my undergrad, and there was again a natural feeling I need to take a break from education. I was working in health and fitness, actually. Probably that was the early years, the emergence of health and fitness, commercial gyms, those types of things, and got all my qualifications to teach and coach, and enjoyed that side of it as well. But always knew that was just a temporary gap from education before I went back to do a master's. So that worked well. And again, when you're doing the masters, when you're at Loughborough, you're in and around a very research-driven environment. And I thought a PhD was a natural route, but I guess I wasn't inspired by some of the very classic PhD physiology type routes. And Loughborough was exceptionally strong in nutrition under Clyde Williams at the time. It's a real emergence of carbohydrate fueling and all the understanding around it. And, you know, some of those type of PhDs, there were methods and approaches where you ended up just manipulating variables for 3 years. And I didn't get excited enough by it. I ended up working in the business management group at Loughborough, that cross sport, looking at this idea of risk management in sport, purely from the basis that professional clubs and professional sports people, ultimately it's a professional club, it's driven by health and safety legislation. You know, you need to understand your risks that are in your business and the risks in a professional sport, because you are employing athletes to be individuals. They're employees of yours. You need to understand the risk, and B, you need to mitigate against it. That's in health and safety legislation. Understanding the risk is ultimately describing the types of injuries and incidences that you get. And then mitigating against it is about how you apply good scientific principles, whether it's conditioning, prevention, prehab, nutrition, all those elements of it. So I stepped into this quite novel space at the time, which was bringing both together, but it's very statistical, a huge amount of analytical expertise and that I developed in that time. And again, that's something I bounced off. I just loved working with numbers and taking the analytical element of it, but trying to do that, that crossed both the management of and the support, the sports science support, particularly in football at that time, was quite exciting.
That's really interesting then. So how did that business element of it manifest itself then? So what did that look like? Was that, what was the remit of that? So is that part of your PhD?
Yeah, it was. I mean, the PhD was called about risk management in professional sport. And I guess that, risk management applies in any industry, in sport as well as the chemical industry. My supervisor, Professor Colin Fuller, came from that industry, didn't understand sport, but those principles were just being applied to professional sports people in, professional clubs. That you need to, you are employing individuals that you're exposing to risk, which is playing and training in the sport. And if you don't understand that risk and mitigate against it, you could be liable. In some perspectives, there are legal cases, right? We're seeing the instances around concussion and how that's grown and evolved. So you have a responsibility as a professional employer, A, to understand the risk, and B, managing it. So, what I take from that, and what still really influences me now, is just the principles of risk management. Because everything we do, we're making decisions, risk-based decisions all the time and everything. So the principles and the science and rationale around it were pretty influential, even now in the job that I do.
Because it's been in the news recently about, see, for example, they're buying these players on big wages, big upfront fee, but they're putting it over an 8-year period. So then you've got an asset of whoever it may be that's coming in, and then they're putting that across to meet financial fair play to depreciate it over, say, 8 years. And so from your perspective, is that something that's looked at from a football team, that they will say, right, well, we've got this asset that costs X amount, we're going to be paying them this? Is it looked at that level of detail?
Yeah, actually, one of the papers I published was about an economic framework for decision making, because there is good evidence that, you're obviously, if your best players are not available, your playing potential, if I call it that, is not as high. So there's a cost to that, because I think where you finish in the Premier League or in any professional league relates to the income you may generate. But, if a player's not available for 12 weeks of the year, you're still paying that salary. You're not getting full benefit of that asset. So it's in your interest to try to ensure all your assets are available all of the time. That's the fundamental. There is an inherent risk where that's not going to be the case, and you need to understand that. But that's what you're constantly trying to mitigate against, aren't you? You want your best players, your best individuals available all of the time, so you can deliver the most potential. And so some of the work that we did was around that. But that thought process has changed massively in the past 20 years. You just look at the scale of investment now in support services, and by that, science, med, to try to look after players. I think the behaviours that you hear about, the change in behaviours, as I say, from 20 years ago, all of those things, it is a full-time job on and off the pitch. Now, as I think, the sport's changed dramatically in that sense, really. But some of my early work was around understanding that risk, quantifying the impact of that risk, in some ways to create a business case about why you would invest in brilliant support services, brilliant people, science, medicine, tech, to try to ensure that you had your players available as often as possible to deliver the best possible performances. But yeah, I think that's normal now. And I think the individuals that often lead those teams and programs within football would recognise why that's important.
And then how much do you think of that stuff is looked at by owners? Because then you might, using Chelsea as the example, then you've got, say, an owner who is running the show in Abramovich at the time, and he's like, no, I want that player. So you've got all of this infrastructure there. And then it's like, actually, yeah, well, whatever the medical says or whatever it may be, they just say, I want that player. So how do those two, from your experience, how do those two meet each other?
Yeah, I'm not close enough in some ways. I haven't ever worked in a football club, so the others probably better judged to probably inform on that basis. I was really fortunate to be in a club actually this week. And the scale of investment and support and decision making and thought process around that is is significant. Like, I've never seen anything like that. The scale of the teams, you know, most of my time was in Olympic sport, professional cycling, but I see the scale of investment now in and around there to protect the assets that you have. It's significant. So my sense is, yes, that everything I read and understand is that it's just at another level than it was to 20 years ago. And in some ways, that original thought process that we're following is just fundamental to that decision making.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see where it goes with all the Saudi stuff that's going on, which is that really is mental. So once you'd done your PhD, then what was your thinking once you'd done that? Like, that was in football. Were you thinking football was going to be the next step?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I never really had a plan in some senses. That was the early years then of the evolution of the British Olympic system. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was just truly honest at the end of my PhD. Yes, I was thinking about working and would like to work in football, but I wasn't really an S&C coach, or, you know, I was probably more analytical. The performance analysis side was some of the things, but those jobs didn't really exist at that scale at that moment in time. It really was embryonic stages of the evolution of sports science medicine at the scale it now is, really, at that point. So I was really fortunate to be involved, but I ended up landing a role with the UK Sports Institute, it was called at the time, which was as you say, it was a very embryonic phase in the evolution of the Olympic system. So in 1997, lottery funding came in. It allowed individuals to live and train full time. National governing bodies suddenly had money to employ coaches, build programs, and I was part of a government system to help support that growth. So I worked within a research innovation technology team, very much on the analysis side, and I think that's where the career sort of started. I mean, it was moving, so it was a bit like a startup, is to be really honest. That's it's a start. It is like a new business in some senses. You end up having to do lots of things to move things forward, and I was really fortunate to work with some brilliant people. You know, and over that period of time, I ended up leading the team around research, innovation, tech, really up to 2013. So went across 6 summer and winter Olympic and Paralympic sports, leading a program which fundamentally was, it was called the Research Innovation Program. We worked really closely with national governing bodies, with industry, with academia, in trying to support their plans so they could win more medals. And we get to take on special projects to support that initiative. Everything from equipment development to new sensors, new technology to understand human performance in the field, you know, instrument and oars and paddles and all of those things, which are now pretty standard, through to better understanding training, through to a better understanding of injury risk and health and all those aspects that are just now fundamental to programs. So, you know, I got to work with some amazing people in industries across the UK, in Formula One and medicine, and just spaces and places that you'd never normally go and explore and investigate, you know, with the aspiration that we're trying to help athletes achieve their best all the time. So yeah, that was a fantastic period of just being able to surf and get to meet so many amazing, when I say surf these levels of expertise that existed in British academia, which is really underrated. There's so much talent there, and industry, really. When we talk about R&D, we often think about it in an academic context, but you know, in a space like, if you take Formula One, they're in R&D every day. It's more industrial R&D. It moves at a different pace and operation because you're trying to make the car go faster. So being able to work in the military in F1 and just get to meet these people and bring them in, get them involved in Olympic sport was an amazing way to develop a network of real technical specialists that you could call on. That would hopefully help British sport be as successful as it could. I think that principle that we tried to build still exists. The R&I team still exists. Many of the people I work with are still there. And it's great to see them continue to push that on. But yeah, most of my career was in that sort of innovation of science, medicine, tech space, really, once I left Loughborough. But it's fortuitous. It was all about timing. There's always a bit of serendipity around it. But I definitely didn't know what I wanted to do at the time. And again, many of the jobs that I've been in since then just did not exist.
So who was part of the team that you joined then at that point?
Oh, God, there's a guy called Roger Morland who was head of it. Deirdre Anderson, there's a number of Australians that had come over just after the games had been in Sydney in 2000. My first manager, if I call it, was a guy called Richard Young, who went to work in high performance sport in New Zealand. Again, just he's a Canadian sprint cyclist, actually. So, like, they wouldn't be known to many individuals, but they were within that Olympic network. Many of them were aware of what the Australians had done leading into Sydney. and their influence in terms of the AIS, which is phenomenal in terms of the landscape of sport, what it's achieved and continues to do. And it was moving fast. As I say, the best way to describe it's like a startup. And the next biggest change being part of that was when we were on the right to host the Olympics, and that was 2005. And I worked with a guy called Peter Keane, who's performance director for British Cycling, and he was the real influence behind securing government investment to then take us on a journey for London 2012. That was another significant, and things just ramped up at that point. But it was scaling up. The system was scaling up and becoming what it was, but it was still moving super fast, really, in that sense. There's a guy called Mike Whittingham, who was director of Sports Scottish Institute. I sort of worked with as one of my line managers as well in that time. But like, you're around so many brilliant people. It's because we work really closely with performance directors and coaches across many of these sports. They've all gone on to do amazing things. And you have this period of osmosis where you're around them at different time periods, listening, observing, watching them practice. Sir Dave Brailsford, Chris Boardman in cycling, Stephen Park, who was at sailings, now it's cycling. Your goats, I was in canoeing, John Ansel, all of these individuals who were real pioneers in the evolution of their national governing bodies, their programs at the time. Like when you're around all that level of wisdom and expertise, you're only going to learn from it. So yeah, it was an amazing part of my career and one that I still have really fond memories of.
Yeah, that was basically your first real role, and it does sound like it's quite hard to beat that one.
Yeah, the job title changed about 5 or 6 times, but that's what I love. The dynamic nature of what was happening at that time in British sport was pretty phenomenal, actually. And you had to move and adapt with it. And I guess I thrive in those environments, those real uncertain spaces. I'm really comfortable with it, actually. I like uncertainty, and I like trying to figure those things out. And that stems from really when I was passionate about sport, but was curious to understand it. That level of curiosity and has always driven my thinking and pursuit to try to understand a bit more.
And so this was, I guess it was in the lead up to 2012. So like, what was that period like in the build up to London?
Good, yeah. I mean, if I reflect back on it now, full on, of course, there was this expectation around it. Full on and enjoyable, and pressurized in the sense of what you were trying to do and the responsibility you felt you had really around that investment being made. But yeah, it was an amazing time. Like, chance of a home games and the chance to showcase excellence in science and medicine and tech, which is what I was sort of involved with. And I felt we did that really, really well. But you're just part of this growing movement of people that were just hugely passionate about giving athletes the best chance to achieve their best. And I got to play, it was a very small cog in that picture, but I love the opportunity that it presented.
So how long were you there for? Like, what prompted you to look for another opportunity?
Yeah, so I left that Olympic system at 2013 and I went to work for England Rugby. But you sort of, probably around 2010, I do reflect on it now. I had an itch in some ways. I'd felt like I needed to do something different. It had been a shift, but of course you're sort of committed to the journey into London. So I always sort of knew I needed to do something particularly different. I was really fortunate to move into England Rugby after that, working in a similar but different space in player development, which is an area that I got a real passion for, but working in the science medicine type space again. Working across teams. It was when Stuart Lancaster was there, and I worked with a guy called Joe Lydon, who was a brilliant mentor to work with at the time. Very different organisation. Remember, all my experience was just this Olympic system and national governing bodies. And the RFU and England Rugby was very different. I wasn't prepared for that in some senses. And there were probably some real catalyst career moments at that moment in time when I went into that organisation. It just operated differently. I guess it wasn't what I expected as well. So I had to adapt in a very different way. But again, an amazing experience. And like many of the individuals that we're working with, so many creative coaches and, different people supporting young players, many who now play at the highest levels of the professional game. So that was a fascinating insight and experience. I'd never really worked in rugby per se, so had an understanding of it. Actually, when I was at Loughborough, my housemates were playing at the highest level when the game was going pro. So yeah, it was a very different experience. Just because the nature of a large organisation, very committee run, there's a lot of tradition. I was used to a pace of change that wouldn't happen in that organisation. So you really have to learn. And that first year was a real insight. At a relatively short period at the RFU, before an opportunity arose to go and work with Sir Dave Brailsford, who had sort of new through the national governance of British cycling, to work on a project with him and a guy called Jeremy Darroch, who's CEO of Sky. So Sky at the time were investing in the professional cycling team, doing amazingly well. And Dave was always positive in some senses about the type of work we'd done with them around that innovation piece, and wanted to try to replicate that in Sky. So I got an amazing opportunity to go across and work with them. That then transferred to like Ineos as well. But again, it was all in that science, medicine, tech space. Professional cycling, you're having to deliver every year. So in Olympic sport, you think, yes, you have a world champs every year, but you're judged every 4 years, realistically. And in, of course, when you get into pro cycling, it's every year, Grand Tours, classics, the calendar's sort of fixed. You're obviously prioritising the Tour de France, and that places a very different demand in the space that I was operating within. You don't have the timelines, the luxuries. There's a different type of process you need. And you can even then compare that to, say, a professional sport environment that has to compete every week. That's a different challenge as well, because you're judged every week on what you're doing, and where innovation may sit in that context is very different as well. So yeah, lots of different lessons. But again, I got to travel Europe, got to visit some amazing places and get involved with some amazing partnerships. So Ineos had some amazing technical partnerships with brands like Pinarello, Castelli at the time, just Cask and helmets, and they were like all up for wanting to push the boundaries around human performance. And when you're operating in spaces where you get the chance to do something new, it's pretty exciting. And you get to push performances on, and again, it was an amazing time.
So, two questions. So, did you move up to Manchester for that role? Was it Manchester based?
No, I mean, professional site. Yes, they had an office in Manchester, connected to the velodrome, and now it's still sort of up that way. But that's mainly central HQ administration, HR, marketing, things like that. The reality is it's a European-based sport. You're all over the place. So it doesn't matter where you are. You're on camps, you're at races, you're visiting partners. It's a working from Europe job is the way I describe it. You're at home some of the time, all the communications are done by conference calls. You got a group of riders based in Monaco, some in Nice, some in the Pyrenees, some in Colombia, all over the place, really. And you got to imagine those riders come together for a race. It's not like a centralized training hub. It's a very decentralized training hub. And, a group of riders may live in Monaco for obvious tax reasons, and you may have 5 or 6 who train together there. But out of that 5 or 6, 3 or 4 may be targeting a Tour, somebody else could be targeting the Vuelta. So it all looks like really, really different. So there's a lot of organisation. Organised chaos is the best way of describing it in some senses. But it's a virtual sport, and it's a highly European-based sport, and there are not many people live in the same space.
And so you mentioned about the environment change going from Team GB or EIS, as it was called then, through to rugby. What was it like at cycling then? What was the dynamic like there?
I mean, again, best way of describing it, it's more like a startup. There's a real smaller group of around 80 staff when you think about masseurs, mechanics, but real alignment to what the team's about. Your front line, it's dynamic, it's fast moving, it's, as I say, a bit like organised chaos. I love being in those environments, and there's absolute pressure to be successful and to win, and everyone's aligned to that. So again, it's definitely moved at a faster pace than the Olympic environment because it had to. But there was the same type of dynamism, creativity, desire, passion to just change the game in some perspectives as well. So just to rank the pace at which things move and the way decisions are made, just sort of in my experiences, I've got the professional cycling world with Sky and Ineos, certainly then the Olympic space, and then probably rugby as a sort of system. But certainly in international sport, whether as in football, as in rugby, really, you're going to remember all your assets, all your players and individuals are employed by the clubs, not by the national governing body. So it takes time. The nature of it means it's a very different environment. You need good, trusting relationships with clubs and the staff who are supporting those players. There needs to be really good alignment around that piece, and developing those personal connections, understanding, alignment. There's no shortcut. It just takes a lot more time. It's not like being in Sky and Ineos where you have complete autonomy and ownership for something. Just get on and crack on and do it, because ultimately you're working with the coach and the athlete, and it needs to move quite quickly. The context of international sport, and that will be football, rugby, cricket's got more of an ownership, is it, where you don't have ownership of the players in some senses. It's based on relationships. So you got to get on the road, you got to spend time with people, you got to understand one another. There's got to be a lot of respect. It just the nature of it means it just takes longer, and that's okay. It's just different. It's not the same, it's slightly different. And that's the things that you sort of need to learn and understand as you progress through your career path.
So for these opportunities then, is it something that you say that you want to move, say, but how does an opportunity come? Is it like something that you see an application for, as word on the street, or how do they come about?
Yeah, it's a bit of everything. some senses, really. I think definitely the human resource, the HR processes around some of these roles are now more systematic and targeted. Got a number of headhunter companies now actively involved in that process. So, or it is sometimes connections and networks, really, and you get tapped on the shoulder. What do you think about this? So that may be more the headhunt type approach, or maybe individual, but you may still have to go through a formal process. So it's varied tremendously in my time and experience. Sometimes people said, there's always been a formal process around that. They having to go through a challenging interview to prove you're the best candidate.
So when you're speaking to whoever it is, and I know it's a bit different with you because this is at the highest level, but it's like culture's a big thing from my perspective. And when Dave Brailsford speaks for himself, like everyone knows him, he's ultra looking for that absolute marginal gains or whatever he's doing. But from a cultural perspective, because you're not always together, how does that affect culture, if at all?
So look, there's lots of things that influence culture, but I think the reality of that environment, even though it's quite virtual, I think the belief systems around all of those involved are really aligned, and therefore those belief systems influence the behaviours you see day in. Like these are, I'll put it in brackets, but like high performance individuals who really got an understanding of what you need to do to be successful. It's a relentless environment to do that, and therefore the selection of those people that step into the environment, there is already an alignment that creates a particular type of culture that's essential for winning. So a lot, without a doubt, culture is a long game. There's lots of things that you need to do to influence and change that, but often you can really change that through recruitment. And in some of those types of environments, really smart recruitment and the right people make it a bit easier, because there's a real common set of beliefs and principles about the organization, its history, what it stands for, its caring and connection of people, and all, everything. So the behaviors you see, which are truly a reflection of that culture, are quite consistent. And I think in some ways, my experience with Ineos is you'd see a lot of that, and it become pretty obvious that those who walked in, not every recruitment process is successful, who maybe didn't align to that, didn't accept it, they'd often make the decisions themselves to realize that's maybe not the place for them. So every place, the culture's influenced so much by the people that are there at that moment in time, the history of the organization. But you got to remember, Team Sky was very young. Probably at the time that I moved into it, only been around for 10 years. So you look at how history and heritage shapes that, it was still trying to figure itself out. And that's where the people's beliefs become more dominant, and therefore the types of behaviors that are acceptable. So it's just every culture and every organization has quite a unique context. But I think particularly for that one at a time, which was a very young organization and trying to find its feet without the length of history that probably it now has, But even then, like in professional cycling terms, it's still relatively, there's been people that have been there from the start. And so there's something now to anchor to about what's acceptable and the way it wants to behave. So, versus another I don't know, there'll be other organizations that got thousands of years of history that shape its culture and the way people operate and behave as well. So it was very different in that sense.
And how would you do, like when you're interviewing someone, they all may come in with a really good CV or credibility of PhDs, whatever it is they've had qualifications. But how would you go about looking for those non-clinical skills about culture, or to assess if someone is right? Because that's, you want to see it's right for them and for you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think often the best understanding I've experienced is when you start drawing on the real life examples people have been involved with. So it's really easy to hypothesize and to talk about, I read this book and I really believe in all those things. Having done it is different. So I think your ability to get people to articulate the experiences and stories they've been involved in tells you a lot about them, about the context of what's going on, their experiences and their behaviors at that moment in time. So I think that's the stuff you've got to try and surface. Interviews can often be hypothetical, or people have got theoretical ideas that they want to share, and that's great, but you want it to be as real as possible. So I think any good interview process will surface the reality and how they responded and behaved in some of those situations. So yeah, in some ways people call it competency based, like tell me an example when you had to deal with conflict. So like it could be things like that, but that's what surfaces. What you want to see from them is real life examples. Oh, I wanted to explain this situation, this is what happened, this is how I felt about it, and this is what I did. And that's the stuff that tells you a lot about an individual, I think. Of course, an interview often worst could be an hour. But the best ones are repeated engagement over periods of time, so you really get to understand somebody. Some of it's done in a non-pressurized environment. There's some formal elements, some informal elements, but you're really trying to understand the individual, but also that it's a two-way process. Because again, when you talk about that culture, the individual being interviewed is interviewing the employer as well, and so they want to understand what's going on in that environment and really get under the skin of it and know what they're walking into, and vice versa. So most interview processes are probably not long enough in that sense. Others are exceptional and they do that in the right way, but you're never going to get 100% hit rate.
Yeah, no, it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's like you say, it's not just one way. It's not just like they're coming for the job. You want to make sure that this is going to be right for them, because otherwise they're not going to be productive, and you want people that are actually thriving in a challenging but enjoyable environment.
Yeah. Owen Eastwood's work in this space is probably the most that I've been able to connect to, his concept of belonging, whether that's a place that you particularly belong in. And Robin Dunbar's work, which has been pretty fascinating. He's an anthropologist, like this evolutionary psych guy down at Oxford, who studied a lot around that connection piece, and what high performance groups look like. But Owen's stuff has been pretty influential, done a lot of work with All Blacks, South Africa, England football, and the idea of how you create this welcome, belonging type culture. But there's a lot of science actually underpins that. And it's, I'm a big believer in that, certainly in the past few years in my current roles, how important that is.
Who did you say? Owen Eastwood. Owen Eastwood, all right. Yeah. Not come across.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. I mean, he's a fascinating individual, and he's written a brilliant book, which I'd recommend.
Right, yeah, no, I'll check that out. Yeah, always like a professional development recommendation. And then, so how long were you with Sky and Ineos?
So 3 and a bit years with them before the opportunity came to Millfield, partly driven personal circumstances really as well, son transitioning schools. Wasn't particularly looking at this moment in time. The team was going through some change, but I guess I'd spent most of my life on the road or away from family, and there was a time when I just knew I had to reconnect. Son was transitioning from primary to secondary, and whether it was serendipity, it felt the right thing. The headhunters got in contact about the role here. As you say, I probably got my first passion for youth development when working for England Rugby because of the role. Often it's a very middle class sport, but the independent schools and private sector play in that as well. So That was insightful. I went through that process. There was a new headmaster at the time that wanted to do something different. I wasn't from education. I'm qualified to teach, believe it or not, but I've never really taught and practiced. And I guess because my background in multi-sport and across different parts of the pathway, so I've been in talent, I've been in extreme and high performance and elite, all of those things, and also where sport sits for Millfield. Millfield's an outlier in the independent sector, really. Sports valued as much as academics, as much as pastoral development. We're not a specialist sports school in that sense, and I think that's really important, but the value sport is placed here is phenomenal. And so it was just a great opportunity to probably combine that family career elements of it. It's been an eye-opener. I've learned so much being involved in education, particularly around teaching, pedagogy and coaching, and some of the skills you see with brilliant teachers and how that crosses across to the coaching field. I think we're missing some tricks there, particularly in coaching in general. When you see the development of high quality teaching in the classroom, and how actually probably in professional sports coaching, many probably don't have some of that prerequisite knowledge around pedagogy and practice. So watching that emerge by bringing both those areas together, I don't know why we use different language, but ultimately we're in the job of developing young people. Some's in the classroom, some's on the sports field, some's in the music hall. Like it's all crosses over, and there's so much sort of similarity. So the move here was serendipity, but timing around family. But it's been an amazing period just to really understand this sector. Millfield's history, a very young independent school, always valued sport without doubt. Some amazing old Millfieldians, Tyrone Mings, Rob Shaw, James Guy. God, just last year we had 8 students who've gone to sign professional contracts, whether it was in cricket, football, so there's something about the environment here that gives people the opportunity to excel. And I think it's because of that balance. There's a real balance between your sport, and your academic development, which is valued, and your pastoral development. So in a boarding house, you could be with 50 other kids, multicultural, we've got 70 different nations, 40% are international. There's something organically that goes on that enables people to thrive because they get to find what they're about. And the founder of the school, who formed the school in the 1930s, was always about that. He'd talk about he was trying to create a school where every individual child will have a unique week, like the schedule's slightly different. So education is not a sausage factory, is the way he describes it. We're going to build a development opportunity around you and your aspirations, needs and passions, and we'll find what those are. And the school's thrived off that. That's the school's culture around that element of it. So sport is massive here. It's valued because of what it brings to young people, whether you are going to go on and do something amazing sport, or whether you still have a positive relationship with sport when you leave for the rest of your life. So you may continue to play your sport at uni, and the vast majority of our kids go to uni to continue to play, or you remain in a healthy and active lifestyle. It covers that breadth of things. Millfield's slightly different in that probably about a third of our students I'll describe as youth student athletes. They're regional standard and above. They may well be connected with some national governing body in some format. But we have this diversity of sports, from athletics, basketball, cricket, riding, fencing, football, golf, diverse swimming. It's just, we have so many individual sports and so many team sports. It creates this real vibrant mix. We've got examples of swimmers who now are Olympic track cyclists. So the ability to naturally find those things are pretty amazing. So the school's always valued it. Big specialist coaching workforce. Programs are exceptional in terms of contact hours, quality of coaching, opportunities, competitive opportunities that are there for you. And it's generally been an innovator and pioneer around that space of youth sport. So it was a fortuitous move, but one that's been insightful and really challenged my thinking around talent and youth development as well.
So what role do you play then, both for that elite level at gone on to play professional sport and everyone?
So I'm the director of sport. My responsibility is to, each of our sports will have a head of sport, if I call it, like a head coach. They're responsible for the design of the program. My job is to support and manage those in their roles. So they'll have a coaching workforce that deliver all the content, and that includes teachers, whose part of their role will come across. So So we do have, as I say, student athletes. I absolutely avoid the word elite in our space because it's youth sport. Like it's interesting how that language, elite and high performance, has filtered into these spaces, and I'm going, no, it's not. Like it's not that. Having been there and experienced it, I keep saying this is development. So we've people look at me surprised in that. I'm saying, no, you just honestly trust me in this space. Our job is to inspire people through sport and create the opportunities, because the reality is, when they leave us at 18, they could still be so far away from achieving anything anyway. So if we can influence their formative years in a positive way, informed by the best evidence around youth development, we've done our jobs. But we're just fortunate to have that diversity of a group of students who are just very good at their age group. There's probably about 60 to 80 students any year who are representing their country internationally at their sport. That may be in fencing, that could be in rugby, England under 18s or something like that. So that level of aspiration sits there, but they're still kids. You still got to remember it. And such a small number of people ever go on to make it. In our jobs, not to create Olympians, not to create professional sports people. It's about how we get the best out of them, and sport's one of the vehicles we use. A consequence of getting that right is that some do go on and do amazing things. They will, achieve the utmost at their sport and become the best in the world at what they do. But it's still, even in our environment, a small proportion of it. So we view sport in a very, very different way. But it's a very professional, accountable environment. Our jobs provide positive, memorable, fun experiences that really test and challenge the development of young people. And sport's one of those amazing vehicles, isn't it, where I describe it as a bit like a rapid prototype environment. Like you always lose more than you win. So there's constantly some valuable life lessons. But if you lose one day, you get it the next day, you get another go. Like it's like this rapid learning space. And there is no doubt we talk about it, but it's a very challenging space for people to thrive in. Competition's a critical part of that. I'm a big believer in competitive sport. I mean, evolution tells you we were born to compete. So all the nature of how you construct really good development experiences in sport, I think, is something that plays itself out here. And I've been observing it, been trying to understand it. I've been trying to understand the bits that are really important and those that are not, so we can better do what we do here. But it's been an amazing, again, like most steps in my career, unexpected. I didn't think I was ever going to be in this space, but it's been so rewarding and challenging, around understanding and getting it to work in this environment. And I have, I sort of mentioned it at the start, it's been frustrating how the top-down influence of proper elite sport has influenced youth sport. I don't think it's healthy. Like everyone thinks that top-down influence, and you've got to do it the other way, bottom up. What's right for child development? Let's use sport as that opportunity, and the rest will happen naturally. I think the way, and it's not been deliberate. Don't get me wrong. I don't think national governing bodies have intended to do that, but that's what's tended to happen. That people think that what happens up there is appropriate at this age, and it's not. And that's what we've really been challenging. People will think that understand Millfield, think, it just does elite sport. And I'm just like, no, that's not. Let me really explain, because people concentrate what they see as the outcome, which is a James Guy, super talented swimmer, came to Millfield for a number of years, has gone on to do amazing things at Olympic level. But if you quantify, I did this with our marketing team, if you really quantify the impact we had, it was his formative years. And if you look at the amount of time he's been swimming, we've probably had about 5% of his life swimming with us. The rest is when he left. So that's why you have to think about our influence. The formative years are so important. Multi-sport, right challenge, right support, lots of things that we now understand through the evidence. We're trying to deliver that in a practical sense to enable talented individuals who've got the internal motivation to bounce from us into the next stage of their career. And that may well be to university. It could be the entry point of a national governing body pathway. Increasingly, many are going to the US now. They use their sport, get really good scholarship opportunities and continue their sporting evolution there, but it's a major part of their life. And if we're doing that well, as you say, there's no, like last year, 8 to 10 individuals got professional contracts and through a non-traditional route. You wouldn't expect, if I look at professional football, we had a young individual sign a professional contract with a club. He's a goalkeeper. He'd only been a goalkeeper for 2 years. So to do that at that late age group is really unusual. And you have stories like we're really fortunate to have Tyrone Mings came to Millfield. I think he was going through a football pathway, never quite worked out for him. He talks about when he came to the school, what it brought to him as a person. It wasn't the football program. He was already self-driven, but I think a bit of serendipity, like he talks about those things, and that's the stuff I think we should be most proud of.
Yeah, I think that's really. I didn't know Mings went there as well. And the interesting about him, he comes across really well, and it's like I think as a person, that's what you hear. Like even the more that I'm just getting older and listening to people, it's like it's people's work rate, it's their character, it's their attitude and their drive to it. It is obviously talent's important, but that is the bit that really is the driver. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Dave B used to use a brilliant simple equation, which is one that I often refer to, but I think it's true. He talks about talent plus hunger and belief minus distractions equals performance. And often, and that's it, that internal drive to succeed and be better at what you do every day. So there's an obsession with process as much as outcome, because if you purely focus on outcome, it's going to become your identity gets too attached to it. But there's no doubt there's some innate talent, and certainly in the high endurance sport, your genetic physiology plays a big part of that. So you need that talent, that internal motivation, drive and desire and purpose to get up on the bike, get on the field, do that every day and just want to be better. And then, of course, as you evolve as a young person, that's critical. When you start getting into senior level sport, ultimately the program around you is their job's to minimize those distractions. Because as you get good, media, like all the other stuff that goes on around you, because as you're getting older, you have family, you have friends, all of that stuff. The job of the program was often to minimize those distractions. So you could show your talent and your hunger, and the rest is going to take care of itself. So it was a really nice way of expressing, I think, quite a nice way of talking about those big things. And the development of that internal motivation is a skill of you sport coaches. How can you create that gives somebody belief in themselves, that gives them the desire to want to come back and do it again. And then when it's really hard, that makes them want to come back and do it again. They're not going to walk away and make a different decision. No, this is too tough for me. So the challenge of working in youth sports, how you create that, because parenting plays such a massive role. The early years of your parent, those real formative years, have so much influence that we've probably misunderstood around that internal motivation, decisions people make. You really got to understand that quite well. So youth sport coaches have got such a role to play in that formative period. It influences what goes on down the line. I say the way Dave used to express it, which is I quite like the simplicity of it. There's no doubt you need some level of talent, regardless. It's a sort of minimum entry point, but that doesn't mean anything without the hunger and the belief that you may need. And then I like the idea of minusing the distractions, because certainly when you get to the very top, the distractions in and around you need managing to the point that they don't take away from why you do what you do. And in some ways, that's the work. We come back to Owen Eastwood when Owen talks about the stories of, and I know Dave Redden worked there as well, or with England football, particularly around getting people to understand why. And I do like the story about why they started playing football. So when you're going to put on that jersey, it's driven by your desire of the sport. You love to be the best you can in that sport. It's not about the circus that's around it, because in essence, at the highest level of sport, that's what it's become.
Yeah, well, I think they're great lessons for getting sport, just in life, of being able to challenge yourself and thriving in sort of challenging. It's what we were saying before, like an environment that is, people want to challenge normally, don't they? They want a purpose. They need something to get up for every day, whether it's sport or not. Yeah,
and often sport may have been an outlet as well for young people. Other challenges in life, whether it is parental or other scenarios that playing themselves out, and sport can become the outlet which they can focus their time and effort and help them manage some of those things. So yeah, sport's quite a unique learning environment, the way I'd sort of describe it, and designed and delivered well, it can change people's lives. I genuinely believe that in some senses. I think our challenge inherently has probably been a bit too organic about it. And there needs a bit more thought around putting the young child in front of you at the centre of all your decision making, really. Because at that age, we say it's kids love to compete and they want to win, and that's great. But your decisions as the coach or as the parent decisions are about that young person's development. You should never take away that competitive drive, because that's essential.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Kelvin Giles, I chatted to him about this, and he was very damning about like just that it is top down. It's people looking at, right, well, we need medals, and then it's that, and funding is related to that. So everything is top down. And he said it's had a massive impact negatively on athletics. And
yeah, I'd agree that, and it's also probably what people see the very, very best individuals do. They think that's applicable for younger athletes, but they forget the journey that person's been on. So, I mean, you used that language, marginal gains, earlier, but there's, I guess it's sometimes focusing on the things that are not going to make the biggest difference. And of course, the support services you have as an elite or high performance athlete are relevant at that level for slightly different reasons. But just thinking you replicate that model at the youth end is not right as well, and therefore all the pressures and thought process that comes with it. Really, I think that balance has got a bit tilted out.
Yeah, no, really interesting. So, just in terms of what do you say if you were giving advice to people, and not that you can give advice on how they would be, but what would be the advice be for people trying to get into professional sport or development or in that area?
Oh yeah, God, this. The landscape's changed so much now. It's so competitive to get into the work of sport, to be honest, if you want to work as a practitioner. And in some ways, those pathways are better defined. But ultimately, if you really want to make that steps in headway, it's how you're going to stand out. And I think the best practitioners, or those that come around, have always been those who've probably very self-driven in some ways to an athlete, done a lot above and beyond, a lot of volunteering type work, sought experiences out as much as possible. I'm really curious about those opportunities. And probably just develop brilliant people skills, very empathetic, could really read others, great listeners, curious learners, like brilliant work ethic. In some ways, the characteristics of any successful person, whether an athlete, coach, or anybody, are the ones that you want to see in those individuals. But the landscape's changed. It's highly competitive, and it takes time to get there. But I think with all of those skills and behaviours, you'll eventually rise to the top. It just takes time.
Great. No, sounds good. Yeah, and then just last question: are there any particular memorable things that have really stuck out to you over the course of your extensive career?
No, it's like in most things, it's always the people that you get to connect with and the people you learn from. So, and I've had so many of those on the journey that I've been on personally. And I begin to understand what gets the best out of me, and that often takes time. And those that I've worked with have probably identified that before me. So they've created these environments that have enabled me to thrive. They've given me autonomy. They've given me flexibility. They know when to challenge at the right time. But that's the environments I like to be in. And so the mentors and managers and people that are supported have probably known that, and therefore created the environments for me to be able to go and do it. So I think that's where the memories will come, really, around the great people that I've been able to spend time with and learn from, that really shape what I do now.
Maybe a difficult question, but are there any ones that particularly stand out as being most influential?
Yeah, Peter Keane, definitely, in the UK Olympic system, just a real visionary thought process. In some ways, Dave Brailsford was also a visionary, but a very different way. So that those spending time in and around observing how they operate, very, very different individuals, but equally not afraid to go for things in a big way, really would grasp big picture and would want to take on big challenges. Pete did it in one way, Dave did it in another. So both very, very different in how they went about that. But yeah, both of those individuals were really impressive people to work with. Like my PhD mentor at the time, Dr. Colin Fuller, so calm, thoughtful, like just subtle in the way he influenced and coached, real skill. That's probably years of working in industry. So everyone's done something in a particular way.
Yeah, great. And actually, no, I've got one more question. So you mentioned that book about from Owen Eastwood. Are there any other professional development books outside of like your sports science world that you think are really worth?
Yeah, I mean, I briefly mentioned Robin Dunbar's work. So he's put one together actually with a couple of management consultants recently, which is about psychology of high performance groups. Again, it's based a lot of this science around belonging and structure. I think I read that recently, which was good. Robert Sapolsky, he's a brilliant scientist. He connects psychoneural social physiology, how the brain influences behavior. Done some amazing work. He's written a book I read again recently called Behave, which is about the best and worst of human behavior. There's a couple. I've got a long list of so many that I'd reference, but that whole area of psychophysiology, behavioral physiology fascinates me, because often our experience in science, and particularly human physiology, is you just look at everything below the neck and you're like, oh, we've missed a trick there. And clearly all the evidence shows that connection around what we see behaviorally, and the connection to our underlying physiology is phenomenal. And Sapolsky's work in that space is pretty phenomenal. And then over the years, as I sort of matured and in more leadership management books, you just sort of recognize that idea of culture, which you sort of mentioned as well at the start. And because I'm curious, I want to understand the science of how that evolves. And that's where Robin Dunbar's work and Owen Eastwood's work and all of those bits really help you unpick evolution and how those things may have happened in societies for survival, and therefore how important connection with people is for survival. And the pandemic has taught us that, and both Eastwood and Dunbar's work, and there are a few others I've read that really connect in that space. That's been interesting. It's a bit like social science related, but our measurement methods and techniques to understand human behaviors and what's driving it now are providing some explanation around why the concept of belonging is important. And in some ways, people have articulated and spoken about it, but now because I can understand it from a scientific perspective, I feel more comfortable with it.
Yeah. No, great. No, I'm going to check them out. I've not done any of those books, so I'm going to check them out. And then I've got James Moores on tomorrow. So any questions I should ask James? He's a
smart guy. God, where'd you start with James? I mean, he's one of the world leading physios, without a doubt, particularly on hips as well, which is why his work in tennis at the moment is important. But again, a really experienced practitioner. Be interesting to understand his journey. I'd definitely I'll listen to the podcast when you've done it, around the steps that he's taken and his thought process, and the way he operates now. He's still a frontline practitioner in some senses, but just recognised for what he does at that level. So yeah, I'd be interested in how he got there, because I've seen him bounce around in different spaces, been in national government, he's been in rugby, been in like many environments. And if there's anything tells us about brilliant people and quite creative people, that exposure to multiple environments is a really important factor. Maybe that's one of the reasons how he's got to where he's got to.
All right, yeah, well, I'm going to dig into it because I'm interested. We've worked with him for years, and he's always been really generous with his time and resources. So no, he's been mentioned a few times on this, so I'm looking forward to it as well. So I'll let you know when it's out.
Enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Cheers, Scott. Great to speak to you, and I'll catch you soon.
Cheers, Andy.
Thanks very much.